Okay, this is David Zierler, director of the Caltech Heritage Project. It's Friday, August 5th, 2022. I'm very happy to be here with Professor Jeroen Tromp. Jeroen, it's great to be with you. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. It's a
Jeroen, to
wonderful
start,
project.
would you please tell me your title and institutional affiliation?
Um, I'm the Blair Professor of Geology and a Professor of Applied and Computational Mathematics at Princeton, where I am also currently the director of the Princeton Institute for Computational Science and Engineering.
And you're on sabbatical now on top of everything else.
Yes, finally, this is my second sabbatical of my career. The last one was in 1998 when I went to Caltech and stayed.
Jeroen, what are you working on, and is it anything specifically related to the fact that you are on sabbatical?
Well, sabbatical is a great time to sort of focus on projects that you really want to bring to fruition. So I started working on a monograph on theoretical and computational seismology that sort of brings together notes from classes that I teach on these subjects. So last year I made a real effort also during the pandemic to write up a lot of my notes in a better format. And so I'm hoping to take this year to whip it into, proper shape for, maybe a monograph on that topic.
Jeroen, just an overall question. Tell me about some of the big efforts in research that are happening in geosciences at Princeton. What's exciting these days?
Um, well, I think what I assume we want to focus on my research efforts. For me, the big change that has happened since I was at Princeton as a graduate student, did my PhD here with Tony Dahlem, and it was a totally theoretical affair. I studied, the asymptotic behavior of surface waves. Um, and since that time, I've really become interested in numerical simulations of seismic wave propagation, now culminating in actually using these numerical methods to do seismic inverse problems. And if somebody had told me when I finished my PhD here that, this is much later, we would be doing the things that we are doing now, I would have said, no way, that's not going to happen. It's not feasible. But that's the reality of things. So I've become really interested in how you can use numerical methods and modern computers to do inverse problems using what is now known as full waveform inversion, where you basically try to use every wiggle in a seismogram to try and constrain the structure. And these days, that's not just in earthquake seismology. So I have students and postdocs working on problems in regional seismology and global seismology that use these techniques. But I also have a couple of postdocs that are using these techniques for non-destructive testing and even for medical imaging. So I have some grants now that look at ultrasound imaging, full waveform inversion, basically for mammography, for example. So I'm still extremely interested in further developing these techniques, improving the imaging algorithms. So it's a very exciting, active area of research that I feel privileged to be a part of.
Jeroen, just an overall question for your research group. The name of it, Theoretical and Computational Seismology. Where is the overlap between theory and computation, and where are these really distinct areas of research?
Yeah, so it just reflects my research trajectory, I guess. So I started out, as I mentioned, doing pure theory, right? My whole thesis was like that. Not an actual seismogram was in my thesis, an actual observed seismogram. Um, and then when I was at Harvard and especially at Caltech, I really developed my interest in computational methods. So there's this wonderful synergy between doing good fundamental theoretical work and then taking advantage of what modern computers and algorithms have to offer to actually solve these equations computationally. So that's really what I'm very excited about. That yeah, you can take the basic laws of physics, of seismology, use good numerical techniques and modern machinery, and just solve these equations. No more asymptotic methods or asymptotic approximations in that regard. So yeah, I think it's an amazing time.
So
Not
just
just in geophysics, but even just in general in physics, this
yeah.
transformation has been phenomenal.
So just technologically, even over the past 20 years, what have been the computational advances that have made the field so vibrant? What can you do now that simply wasn't possible before?
The first thing was the development of cheap, off-the-shelf computational hardware. And so that's really how I got started at Caltech. I was at Harvard at that time. I told you I went on sabbatical to Caltech, and I saw this change coming. I could see that computational science was going to be really important and that the hardware was getting there to the point where you didn't have to go to a supercomputing center, and you could build these supercomputers now using off-the-shelf hardware. So these were called Beowulf machines, where you basically cobbled together PCs to make a supercomputer. And so I went to talk to the administration at Harvard, and I said, we really need to have an effort focused on the computational side of things. We have theory covered, we have experiments covered, we need simulations, and that cannot be done at the departmental level. It really requires a university-wide approach to provide these resources to the community. And it fell on total deaf ears there. Um, and Caltech had been courting me for a while, and I'd been saying no. But Ed Stolper was the chairman at the time. He's a very persistent individual. So he sort of had this open invitation. And so when I started to get frustrated at Harvard, I took my sabbatical at Caltech just because I thought, well, I better just find out what would it be like to actually go there. And then I talked to Steve Koonin, who was the provost at Caltech at the time. And I said, here's what I'm thinking about computation and simulations. And Kuhn's reaction was the complete opposite of what I was hearing at Harvard. He said, yeah, sounds great. Have at it. If you come here, that's what you should do. And so finally, I just felt like I had no other choice. I had to just make that move. And I did. And, it was extremely important. What we did the moment we arrived at Caltech is we built this cluster. It was in collaboration with Mike Gurnis, who's the current Seismo Lab director. It was pretty incredible what we did. I mean, in hindsight, we went and we bought, I think it was 312 processors and memory sticks and PC boxes and disks. And literally, the two faculty, Gurnis and I, with two postdocs, Dimitri Komatish and Ertang, we literally built this thing with our hands. We put it on racks. I'm sure you found pictures of this thing.
Yeah.
It was in the Seismo lab on the floor there. I remember we were putting that thing together, and Helmberger wandered in. I don't know how well you knew him, but he sort of started to rummage around, was looking at what I was doing, and he said, "So in a way, this is sort of your lab," he said to me. I said, "Yeah." Then he looked up and he said, "Well, I was on the ladder putting some memory sticks in." He said, "I'd be amazed if it actually works," and that was it. And he walked out.
That's great.
That was his blessing of the machine. But to his credit, once we got it up and running and it was working, and we really were doing simulations, he totally embraced it, and I think he became a great. He really appreciated that kind of science and the fact that we could do these very careful, accurate calculations of seismic wave propagation.
And of course, this is all discussions about classical computing, a forward-looking question. Given your interest in AI and deep learning and things like that, do you see a world where quantum computation might be relevant in seismology?
I don't know. I mean, you asked about the trajectory, so that got me to Caltech. But the other main thing that happened since then is computing on graphics cards,
Yeah.
so GPU computing. So we made that change too, and that was a massive investment, really overhauling the code and making it portable for GPUs. And that was transformative too. That gained us access to, resources at Oak Ridge, where we've now been since 2012, I think. So 10 years I've been using these Oak Ridge resources, calculating on these massive machines that are GPU accelerated. So yeah, I really believe in keeping up with the hardware and taking advantage of these trends. And quantum computing is one of these things that may or may not ultimately deliver. And so it's definitely something to keep in mind and to think about. But you said AI, machine learning. That's a wonderful field, and there are tremendous opportunities there. And one of the things I'm actually thinking about while I'm here on sabbatical with a colleague of mine, Jeroen Tromp, that I've been visiting 18 years, I think, in a row. We've been collaborating. He knows a lot about neural networks, and we're beginning to think about how we might do both forward simulations and inverse problems using what are called PINs, physics-informed neural networks. And people are beginning to show toy examples where in 2D, you can actually do inverse problems with these physics-informed neural networks, but the physics is one of the things that is part of the optimization in the neural network. And I see tremendous opportunities there. So yeah, it sort of shows you that this trajectory that we are on is by no means finished, and who knows where it will lead in the future. And the speed ups that are being made, both in terms of what is happening with the hardware, but also in terms of algorithms and what we're doing, are absolutely tremendous. Mm-hmm. So I just want to give one example of what is basically what do we call this? A transformative change is classical waveform inversion. Classical, that means we're going back to 2005 when these ideas were invented. But in those inverse problems, the problem scales linearly with the number of earthquakes. So the cost goes linearly with the number of earthquakes. It's independent of the number of receivers. So that's great. You can have as much data as you possibly can at no extra cost, but it scales with the number of earthquakes. Okay. So in the last couple of years, we've invented a way of doing what is called source encoded full waveform inversion, which makes the whole process also independent of the number of sources. Now think about it. You go from a calculation that scales linearly with the number of earthquakes. So typically we use our current global models use 2,000 earthquakes. So you need to do 2,000 simulations at every iteration. We go to 1. Right? So it's amazing. So we do these super simulations where we have all the earthquakes going off at the same time. All the data from all those events are assimilated at the same time. It sounds like it's not possible, right? But then we use these encoding methods that enable us to extract, using basically the Fourier components of the wave field, precisely each and every earthquake from that super forward simulation, just using the orthogonality of the Fourier coefficients. And it works. So, we now go from taking one iteration per week on Oak Ridge machines to being able to do 50 iterations in a day. So it's just another illustration of how things are changing very fast, and it continues to be, for me, a very exciting time in this field.
Jeroen, in drawing a line from the computational advances to the improvement of the research, the fundamental science, where can we take that to actual societal benefit? Taking these technological improvements to improve seismic hazard, or even the gold standard, perhaps dare I say one day, earthquake prediction. Where do you see trends in that regard?
Well, I mean, the ability to do these forward simulations faster and better and more accurately, of course, is of great benefit to seismic hazard analysis, right? Because you can really run lots of scenario simulations. The quality of those simulations improves continually. So that there are definite benefits there. Personally, I've never been a believer in earthquake prediction. I have this feeling that the system is inherently chaotic and therefore unpredictable. And it's when I was director, I would always dismiss it. I mean, director of the Seismo lab, I would always dismiss it and say, look, that's not in the realm of possibilities, at least the way we currently see it. But what is in the realm of possibilities is to really do quantitative seismic hazard analysis, right? So you can be prepared. So you can really experience what it would be like to be in such an earthquake and act accordingly. The other thing I would highlight is early warning, right? So these were the themes that I was willing to engage in, but not earthquake prediction. And I think, honestly, as seismologists, we made a mistake to tout that, to float that possibility, in the 70s when we did, because now that's what people still want to hear and are waiting and for and are sort of expecting. And I'm not sure we'll ever be able to deliver. But having said that, my colleague here at Utrecht, Jeroen Tromp, he's beginning to think that, again, with machine learning and AI, maybe if there is something that is a pattern that a network can latch onto and recognize, who knows? So I'm willing to be agnostic, I guess.
Jeroen, just to go back a few questions about your personal trajectory and interest. Even as an undergraduate in the Netherlands, were you interested in geophysics and earthquakes?
I started in physics, um, and I really liked that. But when I was an undergraduate, it was around the time when the US decided to scrap its plans for a super collider, and theoretical physics really started to look pretty dark. And you know, so I took classes outside of theoretical physics just for breadth and to get an idea of what was happening. I took this one class by Guus Nolet, who's a seismologist at Utrecht, and it changed my life. I mean, it was this incredible course where he used all these tools from classical physics and did all these wonderful things that were really practical and connected to the real world. And I just thought it was amazing. He was also a really approachable guy, and so it goes. I did my senior thesis with him and one of his graduate students, and that's it. So it goes. I mean, everybody has a story like this, but that's how I became a seismologist. They then told me about graduate school. I didn't know there was such a thing, but Roel had experienced this. Roel Schneider, my other advisor, and he said, there's this thing called graduate school. You apply. If you get in, you get an all expenses paid education, and I think you should go to Princeton. He had been there. He knew about Tony Dolan. He knew me pretty well. He said, you would be a great match. It's the best advice. I sent in one application to go to graduate school to work with Tony Dolan. In hindsight, also, I mean, what was I thinking? I have no idea. But that's what I did. And I got in. And he was absolutely right. I was so pleased to be at Princeton as a grad student. And he was such a great, great advisor for me. So,
What was he
yeah.
working on when you connected?
When I first arrived at Princeton, I before I came there, I thought there were two Tony Dolans. There was the Tony Dolan who worked on wedge mechanics with John Suppy and these descriptions of critical tapers and how mountain belts form. And then there was the Tony Dolan who worked on free oscillations and normal mode seismology. And I so couldn't believe that this was the same person that I started looking, at these papers, and it's both F.A. Dolan. It cannot be, are they brothers or, what's going on? And it really was, of course, the same guy, but it was so different that, so that's what he sort of divided his time half when I first got there, and then he sort of went back to being full-time seismology.
Tell me about developing your thesis research. What were your interests? What were you exposed to that focused what you wanted to do?
I actually came and I had a couple of ideas that I ran by Tony, and he liked one of them, and so I worked on that for my first year. And then, that this is how a wonderful thesis experience works, I guess. Tony made a suggestion. He said, there's this book by let's see, what was the guy's name? I want to say Willard or Wiggins maybe. Anyway, some really nice book on asymptotic methods. And he said, we should use these techniques to look at surface waves. I think it would work out very pretty. And we did. And that turned out to be a really large portion of my thesis, sort of looking at how surface waves travel in 3D models and, using ray methods and caustics and all these kinds of things. And I got into Maslov theory and other asymptotic techniques that describes these sort of problems. And he was so great to interact with because, we would be talking almost on a daily basis and stand in front of the blackboard and, work things out. And in the end, I had an extremely productive time at Princeton, but it didn't feel like I was working my ass off. I just really loved it. I was one of the few graduate students that can say they were truly happy.
Yeah. That's
But I don't
great.
know what your experience was.
I had a
But
great time too.
okay, well, but you probably also feel like most of your colleagues were miserable, or at least they acted like it. And that was certainly the case at Princeton. You know, there was a miserable lot. They were not happy. And I was one of the few students who just, I didn't know what their problem was. I really had a great time.
What do you see as your principal conclusions or contributions with your thesis?
Oh, I think, yeah, we did really nice sort of fundamental work on the asymptotic behavior of surface waves in 3D models, and ultimately we ended up putting a lot of that stuff in a monograph that Tony and I wrote together on theoretical global seismology. That was sort of a treatise on every aspect of free oscillation seismology, which I really learned from him. Um, so that's something I did early on in my career, this collaboration with Tony to write this book. And it put together a lot of things, as I said, that he had worked on and that we did during my time at Princeton. And I did that early when I was still an assistant professor at Harvard. I remember asking people about this, and uh, almost everybody said, don't do it, don't do it. You're not going to get any credit for it. And it takes a lot of time. And ultimately, it won't look good for your package when you go up for tenure. And so in the end, I decided to ignore all of that advice and just do it because I really enjoyed doing it. And I knew Tony very well. And I knew that we both had the personalities that once we decided we're going to do this, we're going to actually do it and bring it to fruition. And we did. And so in the end, I have absolutely no regrets that that's what we worked on. But yeah, so that book is sort of a bit of a culmination of our work together.
Jeroen, even in graduate school, was the Department of Energy, the national lab effort in supercomputing, was that relevant? Was that necessary for what you needed to do?
No, no, at that point, I had a colleague. So Tony was interested in that a little bit, and he had a student who worked on coupled mode methods and was using some DOE resources. I was not into that very much at all at that point. It's just that when I got to Caltech, to Harvard, after a while, maybe after a year or so, I became interested in these methods. And I started to play with these numerical methods myself, initially with what I call pseudospectral methods, transform methods. I knew that finite difference methods had been tried, but there were always problems with boundary conditions. And so I knew that that was not going to be the answer for, global seismology. We tried these spectral methods for global seismology, and we worked for like a year and a half, and we could do all these beautiful toy problems, but real problems like calculating synthetic seismograms from a model like PRAM or something like that was not possible. So we never wrote anything up about it. And then I became aware of the spectral element method, and that was through work by Dimitri Komatic, who was in Paris at the time. And I really felt that that looked super promising. So I offered Dimitri a postdoc over email. I'd never met him, never talked to him. I tried to meet with him at a meeting in the Netherlands where they were presenting this work. He wasn't there. So I wrote this email to him afterwards. I learned later that he decided to go to the beach instead of presenting his poster because he was finishing his thesis and he was only there for a day and a half, and he felt the beach was more important than his posters. um, so I offered him this postdoc, and this must have been in May, and I didn't hear anything. So I thought, okay. Then in September, I get this email from Dimitri. Oh, sorry, I just found your email. I defended my thesis in May. I took, he's French, right? So he took the summer off. I didn't look at any email, and I found your email. And is it still good, your offer? So I said, absolutely. So he came, again, sight unseen, in the middle of December, he came to Boston. And yeah, that's been one of the great collaborations of my career. So despite that auspicious beginning, that really turned out to be one of the most important hires I ever made and one of the most important collaborations I ever started. And Dimitri came with me when I came to Caltech. And as I said, he was one of the two postdocs who worked on building that machine. So yeah, that was a phenomenal collaboration.
Jeroen, did you leapfrog the postdoc entirely? Did you join Harvard as a faculty member from the beginning?
Yeah, I did. Yeah,
Was
it
that a
was a bit
rarity?
unusual.
Does that usually happen, or what happened? What was the
No, no, that's pretty
circumstances?
unusual even then. And now I always kind of snicker when I hear, discussions at faculty meetings about, well, this person is kind of young and they're just into their postdoc or this or that. I never say anything, but it's like, okay, sometimes you want to take a risk, right? And so, yeah, amazingly, they decided to make me an offer. I was still finishing my thesis. Um, and again, I asked for advice, and you sort of got two reactions. One is you got to be nuts. You go to Harvard, you're never going to get tenure, and there's all these senior people there who will not be nice to you, et cetera, et cetera. Or, it's a great opportunity. Go do your best, see what happens. And I decided to do the latter. And again, I have no regrets. Harvard, I really enjoyed being there. Um, it was a very supportive, interesting environment. Joran Ekstrom was there at the time, who was also hired as a junior person like me, and Adam Jablonski was the senior person there. Um, yeah, so it was
And
an exciting
you got tenure.
environment.
That worked.
Yeah, I got tenure. So yeah, I think I was very naive when I went there. I didn't really worry about it. I probably should have thought about these things much more. About when I was almost up for, a promotion to associate professor, which is untenured at Harvard, Caltech offered me a tenured position. And I said no, and I stayed at Harvard for an untenured position. I don't know what I was thinking, why I took that risk. Because it's a risk, right? At Harvard, it's really hard. When I was there, 17% of junior people was getting tenure.
Right.
Um, and I remember going to see the dean when this was happening, and he said, well, normally I don't meet with people at your stage of your career, and you're an assistant professor and you don't have tenure. And, Harvard is an institution for the senior faculty. This is what he said to me.
Yeah.
These were his words. And that's really what Harvard was like.
Yeah.
And so he said, I can't offer you anything, but, I still hope you'll stay. That's sort of what I got. And I stayed. Yes, I did get tenure later, so it turned out okay. But yeah, it shows you one fundamental difference between Caltech as an institution and Harvard.
Yeah.
Harvard really is an institution for senior people. Caltech is the example of an institution that just excels at bringing in outstanding young people, giving them everything that they need, and bringing them through the ranks and getting them to do their best work at the institution. So that's my model for how an academic institution should be run. I still think Caltech is a brilliant place in this regard.
Jeroen, intellectually, technologically, and even politically, tell me about the transition at Harvard where you realized you needed more computational powers, you weren't getting the support from Harvard, and how that factored into first Caltech's interest in recruiting you, and ultimately what made that the best option for you.
Well, yeah, it was a very slow decision. As I mentioned, Stolper reached out to me early on in my career at Harvard. I really didn't feel like I wanted to go. I felt safe there and I was doing interesting work. And I didn't want to take the risk of going to Caltech. Then, they started to just be bold and made me this tenure offer. I still didn't take it. But I was sufficiently intrigued that when I finally did get tenure and I wasn't getting what I was looking for in terms of computational, Harvard is very much about what can we do for you? Can we buy you another piece of equipment or this or that? I didn't want that. So then I decided to just go to Caltech, and really I wanted to know what it would be like culturally and what it was like to live there. And once I realized it was a great place, and I knew the attitudes of Stolper and Kunin, I just felt I had to go. And they made another offer, and it was sort of, I remember, he came. It was at the end of my sabbatical. We were flying out of San Diego to go back to Boston. Stolper came to me at the airport and he said, before you go, I'm going to do this one last time, and here is what we'll do for you. And then he left. And I remember turning to my wife at the time and I said, look, this is it, right? And she said, yep. And that was it. We decided to go.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Jeroen, I wonder, so you were aware that you needed this computational power. You weren't getting it at Harvard. Can you just explain your access to the technology? How did you interface with these kinds of computers to know that this is what you needed to succeed in your research before you got to Caltech?
Yeah. So again, in hindsight, the risk was incredible because I knew I wanted to build a machine like that, but I'd never built anything like it. We had software that could sort of run on these machines, and we had done experiments on other people's PC clusters. So we knew that we had software that could do this, but we needed a machine. We needed dedicated resources to be able to do this. So what I asked for startup from Caltech was money to build this damn thing. And we did. We spent, I can't remember now, almost $500,000 on hardware. Mike Jorgensen and I sat together and built this thing. And again, I told you, Helmberger's comment was, I'm amazed it will ever work. I mean, this is it. This is 156 PCs with 2 processors each connected with Ethernet cables through one gigantic switch. That was the computer. And it worked.
Do you have a sense of the budgetary environment at Caltech that made this such an easy offer? Do you think this was related to Gordon Moore's gift, or was this NSF supported? What was supporting this?
The Institute came up with this startup funding, and I think they it's like you spend that kind of money on a geochemist easy, right? If they need a mass spec or something like that. So I think they were coming to grips with the fact that these days, even a computational scientist needs serious resources, and you need to make investments, and they're willing to do that. So that's where the money came from, and it paid off incredibly well. And from there, we did manage to get incredible funding. We had this great collaboration with Dell for a long time. We buttered up this one guy who was in charge of scientific computing. And, at one point, I don't know how well you know this and whether you've ever seen a picture of it, but we had a machine in the basement. It was incredible. It was ginormous. It was like 1,000 nodes. This was for the earth sciences, right? For geosciences. And in the basement, that entire room was one giant computer. David Baltimore came to open up the facility. And so that was a combination of a donation from Dell. We got funding from, I think the Moore Foundation, and it was incredible. The resources we managed to get were just really, out of this world.
Jeroen, being recruited to Caltech, was becoming director of the Seismo lab at some point in the future? Was that in the cards? Was that discussed? Was that part of what you were aiming for in coming here?
Yeah. Well, I was definitely interested in trying that. And Stolper made it a sort of a gentleman's agreement that he said, I want you to do that. I think you'd be great. I think we shouldn't do it right off the bat. You should get a feel for the place for a bit, and then you can take over. And so that happened, I think, 1.5 years or 2 years after I was there, in consultation with everybody else, and I felt comfortable with it. So it was always sort of an unspoken or unwritten agreement.
Jeroen, even as an undergraduate, when you first got interested in seismology to Princeton, to what extent did the Seismo lab loom large in your imagination? Richter, Gutenberg, Benioff, Press, were these names that you appreciated? Did you understand what the Seismo lab represented earlier in your career?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Those sort of, for me, especially as an undergraduate looking at the world, it was Freeman Gilbert and George Backus at Scripps, the Seismo lab, Kanamori, Anderson, And then John Woodhouse and Adam Jablonski at Harvard. Well, and Tony Dolan, Princeton. So
Yeah.
those four places loomed large in my, view of the world at that time.
After Helmberger's blessing that this wouldn't work, what
Yeah.
happened next? When did it start working?
Oh, basically, the moment we powered it up, it worked right. It worked as advertised. We'd really done our homework, right? And we knew how it needed to be built. There was an example of such a machine at Caltech. They were really the first pioneers at CACR to build one of these things. They had one of the prototypical Beowulf. So it's not like we're doing something that wasn't going to work. It was a very well, uh, a very calculated investment and guess. Yeah, it's really great that it did work the way it did, but it should. Nevertheless, it's a lot of moving parts on a machine like that. So we were always rebooting disks or replacing practical things like replacing fans and stuff like that. So the machine only, it lasted 3 years, I think, and at that point you just got to let it go. We sold it to some school, I think, I can't remember. And it's always been like that. The life expectancy of hardware like that is 3-4 years tops.
You're in a different stage in your career, a different perspective to what's happening around you, but comparing geophysics and seismology from Princeton to Harvard, what was different about Caltech? Just the research culture, the interactions between faculty and students.
Oh, yeah, Caltech is so interactive and collaborative. So just the Seismo Lab coffee, right? Twice a day. You have a chance to hang out and see each other. I don't know how much they still do that, but it was a very collaborative, interactive environment. And I think for the right student, it's just amazing. The resources, whether it's finances or intellectual, we're sort of limitless, and the breadth of effort too, right? The Seismo Lab at the time had like 11, 12 faculty. I came from Harvard when there were maybe 4 geophysicists, 5. So it was really it's a big lab with a lot of activity. And then the division is even bigger, right? And there too, I really felt it was, very collaborative and supportive, and the various groups really wanted the other groups to be successful. The emphasis really was on hiring quality young people, early stage career. We'd hem and haw over those decisions again, but then once they were made, done. That person was expected to succeed and given everything they needed to do so. Those meetings were also amazing. We would meet in the evening at Stolper's house, right, 7 o'clock. All the faculty would be there in his living room.
That's great.
Talking about just this, making a hire, right? Yeah.
Jeroen, when it was time to become director of the Seismo Lab, to what extent were you aware of the history of past directors, the things that they had done, and to what extent did that influence the imprimatur that you wanted to have as director?
Yeah, I was very aware of the lineage, in particular Hero's influence. And Anderson before that had done it for a very long time. I remember these stories that at some point there was one grant that supported the entire lab, one NSF grant. I mean, those were the days, right? What I lament most these days about being an academic is the amount of time and effort I need to spend writing proposals, trying to generate funding, and in many ways I feel it's a waste of time. I'd much rather focus on doing research or teaching or working with students. So those were very different days, clearly, right? They were just doing what they wanted to do. The money was there. They were, of course, not where they are now. um, at the different location where the lab used to be. Um, and then Hero was my next door neighbor during my 8 years at Caltech. So I knew him extremely well, and we would always hang out together and talk. And even though we didn't really do that much research together, I always used him as a sounding board. And I did that too if there were ever any issues related to being director. I mean, I guess I tried to be very available and approachable director who just tried to do what was best for the lab, sort of listening to what people were looking for and providing the resources that were needed. And of course, the really important part has always been the network. Right? And I was very fortunate that Eyal Hoxton at that time was running it, and he was doing it very efficiently. And I think we had very good working relationship, as did Hero and Eyal. And so that made that part of the job pretty straightforward and pretty easy. So I was grateful for that.
Jeroen, when did you start thinking about leaving Caltech, given what a great fit it was for you initially?
Um, it's almost entirely personal in nature, in that I traveled a lot while I was at Caltech. I flew typically 100,000 miles a year or something like this. And every time I flew into LA, and I would come in, and we'd come in over San Bernardino most of the time. And 20 minutes later, you're still flying over Los Angeles. And I would just think, what am I doing here? I'm a Dutchman. Where I'm calling you from is my mother's house, which is where I spent most of my time growing up. It's 5 villages, 2,000 people, very rural. And so I'm not really a city guy.
Mm-hmm.
And LA always sort of bothered me as a place to live, which is why I was very reticent to go there in the beginning, to begin with. 9 months without a drop of rain for a Dutchman is almost intolerable. So that's the only thing about my experience there that I did not take to. I did not agree well with Southern California and Pasadena. And I tried to make the very best of it, like everybody does. So when I got a chance to come back to the East Coast and Princeton, when Tony Dolan was ill and had passed away, and Guus Nolet was retiring, I sort of, I saw an opportunity to live a different life and still do top-notch science, just in a different setting. So that's why I left. There were some things I did not like about how Caltech was going about computing. And partly I'm to blame in that I embraced this model where we were using putting the computational resources in the lab and in the division. And these days, that's not very sensible anymore. You really want to have one central place for a university where you build and maintain these systems. These days, it's not just about computing, it's also about the human resources. So, for example, at Princeton now, as part of this Institute for Computational Science and Engineering that I direct, we not only provide computational hardware, we also now have more than 18 research software engineers who help faculty on campus with software challenges, right? So I really believe in this model where all the resources, human and otherwise, are provided centrally and distributed like that. And then there's so much more bang for the buck that you can have. And, Caltech in a way could have had that through Kecker, but it had become this is where it became a little bit more like Harvard, where, chemistry and physics and geoscience, they all had their own computational efforts, and we all felt like we needed to hold on to those. And I think in the end, it was a mistake. And so when I got a chance to be a part of starting that sort of from scratch at Princeton and doing it the way I had, I was beginning to see it needed to be done. That was exciting. And, in the end, I can look back on now more than 12 years here and 14 years almost now. And really, we have made an incredible transition in this regard. So that's been really good also for me as a scientist and as a researcher. We've been able to take advantage of those those developments very effectively. But yeah, this is all just to say that I left Caltech, not easily and very reluctantly, not because I was unhappy there scientifically in any way, shape, or form, more because of other more personal reasons.
Jeroen, as I'm sure you know, it's been a long-standing goal at Caltech to secure an endowment for the
Yeah.
Seismo lab. Were you involved in that effort at all as director?
Oh, very much. We tried so hard. Stolper and I, there were a number of individuals that we thought might be targets, and I'd go visit these people and spend time with them and try to butter them up. And it never materialized. And we always felt like, how can this be? It's such an institution. We have such a well-defined need for, long-term resources to support the network, support efforts in early warning, to support the computational things that we do, and just the postdocs and the students, and we never managed to pull it off. And it's one of the regrets of my tenure as director, that I did not manage to make it happen.
Caltech has had such success with endowments in so many other regards.
Yep.
What is it about seismology? It's such a proud history at Caltech. What makes the endowment so elusive, would you say?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I've always felt that if we had the right person who saw, or who really could appreciate everything that goes on in that lab, it should be possible. But and it's 14 years later, right? So it still hasn't happened. So it's not just me.
Right. Don't take it personally.
Right.
You're in
No, but exactly.
as director, what opportunities did you have for collaboration at the institutional level with the survey, with the USGS?
Yeah, that was always a wonderful connection too. Lucy Jones was in charge at the time. Again, we had excellent connections. I remember the 2004 Sumatra earthquake happened during my tenure as director. And, Lucy and I said, look, we got to do something, right? This is such an amazing earthquake, the first nine since 1964. We got to do something. And so we decided to put on a show in the Beckman, at the Beckman Hall on the campus in the evening, sort of telling stories about this earthquake as we, basically what we'd learned up to this point. And it was open for the public. I couldn't believe it. That room was packed. People were so interested. And they really came out in droves to hear about this earthquake. And so, the USGS and the Seismo Lab, we put on this show, and it's really great. It's just one illustration of how effective we would work together. The media center was in the Seismo Lab. We managed to get that completely renovated. Yeah, so that connection with her, and then Ale, and then the lab, those three things that sort of are an integral part of running the operation was super smooth and super easy. Yeah.
There's a long trajectory from the Seismo Lab many decades ago being, of course, totally a boys' club to where it is today. Many women graduate students, several women tenured faculty members. Where do you see your time as director on that bigger transition to making it a more diverse place?
While I was there, Joanne was there already. But since then, during my time there, we brought in Jennifer Jackson and Nadia Lapusta. Already then, we had a really good balance, I think, of male and female graduate students. And it was a pretty amazing international affair. But to be honest, I don't know what things look like these days in the lab. But, while I was there, I had probably an even number of male and female students and postdocs. Jinya Liu went on to become a very distinguished professor at University of Toronto. Min Chen went on to have a great career at Rice, and unfortunately, she committed suicide while she was a professor at MSU. Vala Jorlef's daughter was a female graduate student who's now back in Iceland. Christina Moranci, she was a postdoc with me, now at Livermore Lab. And Alessia Maggie was a postdoc, a woman. She now is at the University of Strasbourg. Ying Zhu, she was a postdoc with me and went on to become a professor at Virginia Tech. I can go on. It was already pretty well balanced, I think, at that time, and I hope that has continued to be the case. Yeah.
What were some of the most significant graduate students you had when you were director?
Well, my Carl Tate, of course, was one of my very successful graduate students. He really was the one who brought the inverse methods that we still continue to use to this date to early fruition. He did the first inversions, constructed the first model of Southern California. He used that PC cluster and ran it into the ground. I don't know if you talked to him, but he really, that was pretty incredible what he managed to get out of that machine. Dmitry Komatich was my postdoc. He's the one who came with me and helped build the machine. He went onto a very illustrious career in France, extremely successful, but unfortunately he too ended up committing suicide. So I've lost one graduate student and one postdoc that way, and it's
Have you kept up with the Seismo lab over the years? Have you been in touch with faculty? Are you aware of what's been happening?
Not directly in the lab itself, but of course I am in touch with people who work at the lab all the time. I see them at meetings, not so much of late, right? It's been a very strange time, but of course I know most of these people really well, and continue to be very impressed with everything that is happening in the lab. But it's been a while since I visited. I'd like to come back sometime and see it again. I was there for some meeting in honor of Hiru when I forget what he did. Maybe he officially retired. It's possible that.
He still comes in every day, so retirement, that doesn't mean anything to him.
I'm well aware of it. I used to joke that, I would come to my office around 8 and I would leave around 5:15, 5:30. When I came there, Hiru was there. When I left, Hiru was there. So I have no idea when he actually came to work or went home. Yeah.
Jeroen, if not the endowment, of course, what are you most proud of in your tenure as director of Seismo Lab?
That's probably not a success, but I think what worked well is how we developed the Seismo Lab into a real powerhouse in computational geophysics, and we provided the computational resources to do that. I think we also we managed to maintain and continue to build out the network very well. While I was there was not a single really large earthquake that actually meant everybody would show up. So I was director for 5 years, and we didn't have any serious earthquakes during that time. And to be perfectly honest with you, I didn't mind. I maybe a professional hazard, but I used to think about earthquakes all the time while I was there. I would drive around and I would sit under one of the overpasses. You know how they set up the lights where you're under the overpass waiting for the light before you can go onto the freeway. And invariably, as I was sitting there, I would think, not a good time for the big one, So I don't mind having not lived through the big one while I was there as director.
Jeroen, finally, last question, looking to the future. It's as much a question about how you define your research agenda as it is about extrapolating technology trends in the field. But Where do you see your research going 5, 10, 15 years out from here?
Yeah, so we sort of touched on that at the very beginning when we talked about computational trends and these kinds of things. So where I see the real opportunities is in again harnessing what's happening in computational hardware, but combining that with what's happening in scientifically. So that the example we talked about is pins, physics informed neural networks. That looks super promising to me. You combine that with other advances like this source encoding that I mentioned that makes the process of doing inversions independent of both sources and receivers, that speeds things up beyond your imagination. And so sorry about the dog, it's the neighbor's dog.
It's okay.
Yeah, so I think uh, being able to do things that fast, it just means that the quality of the images we'll be able to produce, the resolution of the images will just be, yeah, tremendous compared to where we are at this stage. And I think this will be a really exciting time also for graduate students and postdocs. They will be able to take advantage of all of these things and capitalize on all of these things. And, that will bring opportunities for more complex physics. So, we are looking at anisotropy, so the directional dependence of seismic wave speed. But I think we can really do that much more accurately. The same thing with attenuation, so the dissipation of seismic energy. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of trying to infer what do these variations look like three-dimensionally, say, on inside the Earth's deep interior. And I think all of those things, it's sort of almost there. And it's going to happen in the next, hopefully before I retire, we're going to see tremendous progress in all of these areas.
Jeroen, this has been a great conversation. It'll be a terrific addition to the Seismo Lab History Project. So glad we connected. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful that you're